There we go. I don't want to forget. We are recording the talk and we will share the link after the event. Western students, if you're attending this event for signature credit, I will be putting the link into the chat momentarily so you can record your attendance. There will also be resources in the chat about the speaker and about the Ethics Center. And before introducing our speaker, I'd like to make some acknowledgements. First, this lecture is funded by the Winnie Veenstra Endowment for Peace Lectures. Second, we have a number of co-sponsors we'd like to acknowledge: the Department of Political Science at Western, the Department of Economics, the Global and International Studies Program, and the Haneke Institute for Global Education. So without further ado, I'd now like to introduce our 2021 Winnie Veenstra Peace Lecturer, Dr. Dursun Peksen, Dunavant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Memphis. His teaching and research interests revolve around the subjects of foreign policy, international political economy, and human rights. A large portion of Dr. Peksen's research focuses on major socioeconomic and political consequences of economic sanctions and external armed interventions for targeted countries. His more recent work also examines the possible role of globalization and international financial institutions on labor rights and illicit economic activity. He has published more than 50 journal articles and edited a book on international democracy promotion, and is currently serving as editor for the journal International Studies Review. So enjoy the talk, and Anastasia, we can take down that slide so that we can get going here. Thank you so much. Whenever you're ready.
All right. Hi everyone. I would like to start with thanking Sandy for putting together this event, and thanks also for all the sponsors who made this event possible. I would like to also thank you all for joining us today. I know, if I'm not wrong, last week was your spring break and you had the Easter, Easter break. I'm sure you have nothing else more fun to do, so you're excited to be here to talk about sanctions, right? Given how popular sanctions have been in our foreign policy. So I hope you will find my talk helpful and productive. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about the ethics of economic sanctions. My talk is based off of an invited article that I wrote for the journal Ethics and International Affairs. It was part of a roundtable on the ethical implications of economic sanctions in foreign policy. So I will heavily most of my materials come from that article. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very briefly begin with defining what sanctions are and how effective they are, right? Sort of like just to make sure that we are on the same page. I'm going to offer you sort of a brief conceptual discussions and how much sort of coercive economic statecraft evolved over time. And after that, I'm going to talk about the possible consequence of sanctions for targeted states, right? So to be able to sort of figure out what exactly sanctions do in terms of this cost-benefit analysis. Do sanctions do more harm than good, or are sanctions actually quite effective due to their efficacy rate as well as some externalities? So I'm going to sort of not only talk about how exactly sanctions work, but their possible sort of often unintended effects. And after that, based on this review of the existing literature, and in particularly empirical research on sanctions effects and consequences, I'm going to make a case that sanctions are in general morally problematic policy tools. I'm going to use utilitarianism as a moral theory and make a case that overall sanctions tend to be sanctions are not morally appealing policy tools. So in terms of what sanctions are, economic sanctions are government-led, government-enforced restrictions, right? It includes oftentimes exports, imports, and the flow of finance, right? This is what sanctions are. There could be also private boycotts or other forms of sanctions, but oftentimes in my presentation, I'm also referring to these official restrictions imposed by governments or intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union. why should we pay more attention? Maybe not attention, but also more attention to economic sanctions these days, right? They have become, in part because they have become increasingly common foreign policy tools. So if you look at the United States and sanctions record, is of today over 20 different countries, as well as more than 1,000 non-state entities, such as like drug cartels, the individuals, sort of rebel groups or companies currently are blacklisted or sanctioned by the United States. The United States is the leading sanctioning country since the turn of the 20th century. No country uses economic sanctions as a tool like the United States. But there is also a growing interest in the use of sanctions by other major actors in international affairs. The United Nations is a good example of it. During the Cold War, the United States imposed only 2 sanctions regimes. But since then, the United States has now over 20 different sanction regimes. There has been a significant spike or proliferation of sanctions used by the United Nations. The same applies to the European Union. And recently, China also sort of discovered this tool, right, given its growing sort of global economic sort of influence. China and also other countries like Russia also frequently rely on economic pressure as a form to induce compliance from countries that they have disputes, right? So sanctions have not only become more popular, right, in the landscape of international affairs, but there's also this change in the type of sanctions that sanctioning or sender states oftentimes levy. It used to be the case that up until the Iraq case in the 1990s, most sanctions or almost all sanctions were conventional sanctions, right? These were the types of sanctions that were targeting the entire economy in terms of trade and financial restrictions. Due to the major damage that comprehensive sanctions did to the Iraqi society in the 1990s, there has been this shift towards targeted sanctions. These are the type of sanctions that aim at specific individuals rather than the entire society, and also and try to sort of minimize humanitarian aid. So these are, if you look at most of the ongoing sanctions regimes, they are smart/targeted sanctions. Things like asset freezes, right, or travel restrictions, sanctions targeting specific sectors like the oil industry or the defense industry of a target country, or arms embargoes. These are types of more fine-tuned types of sanctions that we observe today. And that's sort of like interesting in the sense that when as we delve into the sort of ethical implications of sanctions, you will see that one justification made for targeted sanctions was that this was the best way to minimize civilian damage, hence make sanctions more appealing, morally more appealing. But again, and they are supposed to be more effective than conventional sanctions. Okay? So in terms of the effectiveness of sanctions, really, this is important to know. There has been significant research on whether sanctions work. That has been arguably the most widely asked question in the sanctions literature by both political scientists and other social scientists. And what we know about sanctions is that sanctions are relatively ineffective policy tools, right? If we sort of adopt this very modest definition of effectiveness that involves full or partial compliance of targets in line with the stated policy objective of centers, we know that sanctions work about 1/3 of the time, about 35% of the time, right? If you were to apply even a stricter definition and look at the cases where target countries like Cuba or Venezuela, others, right, in terms of their full compliance, that number goes to as low as 10%. But sanctions are somewhat ineffective policy tools. There's some consensus in the literature that they are more ineffective than effective in addressing a wide range of policy issues, whether it's promotion of human rights, nuclear proliferation, punishing state sponsors of terrorism, or other cases. In general, sanctions are ineffective. right? Obviously, the question is that are targeted sanctions any better, right? That's what the United States government and other countries, sort of other sanctioning entities these days use. I can tell you that existing, based on the existing literature, targeted sanctions are not necessarily any smarter than conventional sanctions. Remember, these are the types of sanctions that are that target specific entities that are in charge of wrongdoing, right? That was the purpose of it, and they were supposed to be more effective and less damaging. But we know that their efficacy rate overall is actually lower than comprehensive sanctions. If you look at it in terms of like full target compliance, the efficacy rate of targeted sanctions could be as low as 10%, according to the existing literature. And this type of sanctions also are continued to sort of inflict significant damage on civilians or innocent bystanders. The damage goes beyond the targeted individuals or other entities. So there, overall, it's fair to say that despite this hype and expectations concerning targeted sanctions in the 1990s that they will be more effective, there is really not much evidence that suggests that they are any different from sort of conventional traditional sanctions, right? So now I want to just spend a few minutes on the question of why sanctions don't work, what explains the inefficacy of sanctions, right? So I'm going to sort of present two theoretical perspectives, right? One of them is I'm going to call it the naive theory of sanctions, right? This is a theory that tells us how sanctions should work in theory, right? And then I'm going to offer my alternative view, and I'm going to tell you how exactly sanctions actually work on the ground in practice. So I'm going to just sort of, this is important for us sort of to understand to be able to sort of have a good ethical sort of, make an ethical case, right? An argument that it's important that to understand why sanctions don't work, right? So policymakers, when they impose economic sanctions, whether it's in the United States and other parts of the world, right, there is this expectation that sanctions will work because of sort of two interrelated causal effects or interrelated causal factors. First and foremost, when the United States and other countries impose these trade and financial restrictions on a targeted government, the expectation is that this economic pressure will result in reduced state capacity in targeted states, right? The lack of access to scarce economic resources and military resources will reduce the targeted regime's ability to maintain the order and hence use sort of repressive means and other things to be able to sort of perpetrate and maintain its authority, right? So the idea is that if sanctions undermine their ability to maintain the restored order, and then that it will create more incentives for targeted regimes to give into demands made by the United States and other sanctioning entities, right? Policymakers also expect that sanctions could be effective in inducing compliance, in part because it can also create result in like legitimacy issues for targeted regions, right? If sanctions cause significant damage on the overall economy of targeted states, if people suffer from poverty, they have no access to gasoline, or if they have no access to medical devices or other things that basic needs because of sanctions, the expectation is that people are likely to sort of mobilize against the target government, and then it will pressure government to do something about it. And likewise, not only the general public, but sanctions could also result in defections from the sort of the close winning coalition of targeted regions, right? If there is not enough incentives that the target regime offers to their those who are in their close circle, winning circle, and it could be result in more people defecting their regime and hence creating even more pressure for target regimes to address this dispute with the sanctioning country to end this ongoing problem. So the expectation is that to the extent that sanctions undermine coercive capacity of states and result in legitimacy loss in target states, we should expect more sort of successful sanction cases, right? But this is how I think sanctions should work in theory. But we know that given the relatively low success rate of sanctions, we know that that's probably not how sanctions in most cases work on the ground, right? So I'm going to sort of offer an alternative explanation to help you understand why exactly sanctions don't work the way they do. the way they are expected by policymakers when they impose sanctions against like repressive states, authoritarian governments, even democracies, right? Why is it that sanctions tend to be more ineffective than effective, right? First and foremost, whenever sanctions are imposed, what we know is that target regimes barely feel the intended pressure of sanctions, right? Because they have the monopoly over the use and distribution of public resources, right? Think about a country like Venezuela or Cuba or North Korea, right? The regime has full control over the existing resources. What happens is that they're able to control the redistribution of existing resources, right? They are able to escape the intended of costs by directing resources towards themselves and away from ordinary citizens of Cuba or other sanctioned countries. So what happens is that they don't feel the pressure enough to be able to sort of give and take external pressures, right? The other thing about sanctions is that they're really hard to enforce, right? Oftentimes, target regimes actually find a way to have continued access to weaponry, to economic aid or the other sort of economic restrictions they face through both formal and informal sanctions bustings, right? In terms of formal sanctions bustings, they always find a willing third-party state or an economic entity to trade with them to make up for the loss caused by sanctions, right? Think about North Korea, right? North Korea is under sort of extensive sanctions, right? But the fact about North Korea is that about their 80% of their trade is with China, right? If China is not on your side when you impose economic sanctions again on North Korea, you're highly unlikely that those type of sanctions regime work because of this black knight effect or the willing third party non-sanctioned states that will make up for that cost incurred by the sanctions. And also targeted regimes are also good at using informal sort of channels to be able to remain unharmed by sanctions, like through smuggling and other forms of clandestine black market activities, or through informal economy. They actually continue to find a way to reduce the intended effect of sanctions, hence remain defiant against sanctioning entities, right? So that's part of the reason why, as opposed to the expectation that sanctions will hurt targeted regimes, what we see is that actually their ability to remain empowered is intact because of their ability to control, again, have maintained enough coercive power, state capacity to stay empowered. And the other sort of explanation as to why sanctions rarely work is that when these external major powers impose sanctions, right, especially against repressive regimes, right, what happens is that these regimes actually react in a way that is not what the sanctioning states intend, right? So instead of giving into pressure, right, if the United States imposes sanctions against the military regime in Myanmar today, right, or against the Russian government, or against the other sort of repressive and authoritarian regimes, what happens is that those target regimes actually, sanctions create for those target regimes to become more repressive and less conciliatory towards external demands, right? It is in part because they know that giving into external sort of demands for political reform and other changes will bring their end, right? From a political survival standpoint, like target regimes think that, right, they will pay a very heavy domestic cost if they comply with these demands for changes, right, reforms and other things. That's why they actually do the opposite. They remain defiant, and to prove that they are willing to withstand, they actually become less conciliatory and more repressive in domestic politics to show that they are still in charge, right? And so in a related way, sort of in a very related sort of logic, that what happens is that even if there is this uprising in the society, people are mobilized against the target government. What they do is that because they have still, they maintain their coercive capacity enough, what they do is that they actually respond to external sort of domestic demands for change with repression as well. So what happens is that sanctions actually create more incentives for target regimes to resist and overall make the things worse. So so if you look at it, the overall outcome oftentimes is that sanctions result in more defiance than compliance because of these two causal arguments that I would make. So the low success rate is more about this alternative view than the expectation that the targets will put enough pressure on target regimes to alter their policies in the way that sanctioning states expect, right? Well, sanctions are ineffective, right? Again, before making a sort of a moral argument, sort of like, do we know anything else about sanctions? So I would argue that sanctions are not only ineffective in achieving their intended policy objectives, right? Sanctions are used to address a wide range of policy issues. It could be a trade dispute, it could be an environmental dispute, it could be a human rights issue, it could be a genocidal case, terrorism, and many other cases. Right? Sanctions are popular because they are used to address a wide range of sort of policy disputes, but they are not only ineffective in achieving whatever their public stated objective, but they can also be counterproductive by making the things worse in targeted states. That's what, and I call this negative externalities of sanctions. My own work and others show that actually in targeted states, during sanction years, we see an increase in the extent of repression, human rights abuses by the target government, right? Again, this external pressure actually creates more incentives for regimes to respond to even their domestic rivals with violence and other repressive means, because that's the only way that they can signal both to their supporters as well as international community that they are in charge. Think about the Maduro regime, right? When the United States and other international actors imposed sanctions, right? Maduro was more willing to, in the case of Venezuela, was more willing to go after and jail their rivals, his rivals, rather than sort of open up the political system for more parties and make it more democratic, because that's the way that the Maduro regime thinks that they will survive, right? So sanctions actually not only improve human rights conditions, but on the contrary, may make the things worse in terms of violence and repressions. We also know that sanctions, right, obviously depending on the sort of severity and the cost of sanctions, but they also result in a number of different sort of humanitarian effects in target countries, right? My own work and others show that in sanctioned countries, there's a notable decline in public health conditions, right? More poverty and lack of access to medical tools and other things actually reduce the quality of life in targeted countries, and we see a spike in things like child mortality rate because of sanctions, right? Or sanctions are contributing to the deteriorating public health conditions. Research shows that sanctions countries are also associated with more poverty and higher levels of income inequality. There's another thing sort of shows that even when sanctions impose, achieve their intended policy objectives, these humanitarian conditions are there, right? To keep in mind. And what's even more important to sort of recognize before delving into sort of some of these possible ethical implications of sanctions is that oftentimes this impact that we are talking about is uneven, right? Sort of there is this obvious disproportionate effects on marginalized segments of society, right? Studies show that following economic sort of like the segments of society that incur most of the cost of sanctions tend to be marginalized groups, especially women, elderly, or even sort of minority groups. So there is actually a significant increase in the extent of systematic discrimination that these marginalized groups face because of sanctions, right? The logic is very, very straightforward here, right? Target regimes and their close circle almost always find a way to disproportionately use existing resources in their favors. Even when we observe poverty or other forms of humanitarian problems in target countries, again, the marginalized groups appear to be the ones that incur most of this at the cost. So, so what do all these things, these two sort of aspects of sanctions tell us about the morality of coercive economic state, right? We reviewed the effectiveness question, right? My argument has been that based on existing empirical research, sanctions tend to be more ineffective than effective, and also sanctions can be can backfire by making this, by causing more humanitarian and other forms of problems in targeted countries. Based on this, what can we draw from this literature? What can we learn from this literature in terms of sort of ethical dimensions or ethical aspects of coercive economic states? So in the article that I mentioned earlier, and I know that Sandy will share it with you, or there's a link to that, sort of like, I was invited to write that article, and I'm not a, full disclosure, I'm not a philosopher or a political theorist, but I was, because my research shows that sanctions have this very notable major negative effects. I was asked to sort of like approach this consequence of negative consequence of sanctions from an ethical sort of standpoint. And then I read the existing literature, and I thought that this utilitarianism argument seems to be one of the most compelling ways to assess the sort of morality of sanctions. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just talk about utilitarianism as a moral theory, right? I'm sure some of you in the audience are much more well versed in this literature, but just very quickly, based on my own understanding of utilitarianism, it's an ethical theory, right? And the core idea of this theory is that, right, whether actions, right, policies in the case of economic sanctions are morally right or wrong, right, should depend on their effects, right? So utilitarian approach tells us that we should look at, right, the outcome of our actions to see if it does more good than harm, right? And it's a form of consequentialism in the sense that, right, the moral rightness or wrongness of an act, right, depends on the consequences of it produces, right? If that's the case, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to apply this idea to the case of sanctions. I am going to look at sort of two things, right? Are sanctions effective, and what sort of, and in terms of the consequences, right? If that's what utilitarianism is about, sort of, but in terms of consequences, do sanctions achieve their intended policy goals? And also, do sanctions produce any intended or unintended sort of effects that are favorable to targets or senders? So I'm going to look at the effectiveness and humanitarian consequences to be able to use the utilitarianism logic. And also, I'm going to, I know there is some debate in the literature on the ethics on utilitarianism as an ethical theory in terms of who this idea applies, right? What I'm going to do is that I'm going to look at all the actors involved when I make this judgment based on the effectiveness and consequence of sanctions to see sanctions have done more good or than harm in the broader sense. So in terms of target states, right? Sort of, I think the case I would argue is that from an ethical standpoint, right, and using utilitarianism as our sort of theoretical basis, what we know is that sort of like sanctions are really very difficult to defend for target states, right? The existing literature, once again, I briefly reviewed, tells us that things appear to get worse, right? Right. It could be worse economic, political, and humanitarian conditions. And more importantly, what happens is that there's not an even distribution of costs, whether it is comprehensive sanctions or whether they are targeted sanctions. What happens is that those who are part of the marginalized segments of society, those who are outside the sort of ruling coalition of targeted regimes, incur most of the costs, right? If that's the case, is that it's obvious that for target states, sanctions rarely do anything good, right? Well, some of you may sort of say that, look, what if those who may actually want these sanctions in target states, right? So in some of these repressive regimes, actually the opposition or anti-government group wants sanctions. But even for those groups, I would argue that, right, their demand for external pressure makes sense. But what happens is that oftentimes they get the worst of sanctions, right? Because target regimes react in a way for the opposition to even get weakened and suffer more. Hence, from an ethical standpoint, right, considering that the target states as part of the actors involved in the use of sanctions, I would argue that sanctions are ethically problematic policy tools, right? Well, how about sanctioning states, right? This is where probably most sort of ethics scholars focus on. I will argue that we should both pay attention to target and sender states and to be able to better understand the utility, net utility of sanctions. But even if we are willing to sort of overlook the obvious cost that target states incur, right? What happens to sender states? Do they get any utility? What is the net utility of sanctions for sender states, right? Here, the argument is again, sanctions are, in general, very ineffective, right? From this consequentialist perspective, right? It's clear that when sanctioning states impose all these economic and financial restrictions, they are highly unlikely to achieve their intended policy, right? The effectiveness question clearly, the data on effectiveness clearly show that sanctions, and at least sanctioning states should expect that they are unlikely to achieve this behavioral policy change that they demand from targeted states, right? It's not only the case, right? In terms of the net utility, sanctions could also be very counterproductive for target sender states themselves, right? First and foremost, we know that they make the things worse in target states. If a sanctioning state uses sanctions on moral grounds of promoting human rights, democracy, more rights and freedoms, right? The argument here is that you are less likely or unlikely to achieve that moral sort of justification that initiate or justifies the sanctions, right? On the contrary, you could even make things worse in terms of human rights and other sort of morally appealing policy objectives that are often invoked when using sanctions, right? So from a sender perspective, the intention might be there, but in terms of achieving that goal, right, ending terrorism, stopping genocides, promoting human rights, or other things, that could be the opposite. It could even either have no effect or make the things worse, right? So that's sort of the obvious, but also sanctioning states, right? If they have this utility calculus in their decision to impose sanctions, and I would argue that actually most policy makers do this utility calculus without calling it utilitarianism, right? It's also fair to say that sender states should expect that sanctions might actually, in the long term, might create more tension between themselves and targeted governments. Think about the United States history of sanctions against Cuba or Iran or North Korea, right? Some of these sanctioned countries, target countries, have been under US sanctions for decades, right? What happens is that over time, these countries have no incentive to work with the United States, even over other foreign policy issues. On the contrary, they have more incentives to act against the interests of or national interests of the United States. What happens is that regardless of what the issue under dispute, in the case of sanctions, these major sanctioning countries, whether it's United States, whether it's China, whether it's the European Union, should take this fact into account that things actually may get worse for their overall foreign policy, foreign relations with the countries under their coercive measures. So there could be, again, more tension between senders and targets from a sort of a utility perspective. I would also argue that, one of the most overlooked aspects of sanctions is what happens at home, right? Sort of like for major powers like the United States, maybe domestic economic actors, whether they are farmers, whether they are sort of exporters of certain goods and products to target states. The overall economy of sender states, if they are big economies like the United States, they are unlike the economy in general won't feel the pressure of sanctions, right? But it's still, even for those major powers, it's still ethically problematic because there are certain businesses in this country, right, that incur some of these costs, right, that tend to be overlooked when we have this broader sort of effectiveness, sanction effectiveness discussion, right? So think about farmers, for instance, in our sort of long history of sanctions against Cuba, right? Some American farmers probably would have benefited from the lack of sanctions against Cuba, right? Or if you ask the CEO of Coca-Cola, right, or Boeing, or some other major American sort of companies. Like they will tell you that if we didn't have the sanctions against Iran, right, or other countries, right, they would have more economy. They are losing some businesses because of these restrictions imposed by their own government, right? Without their own consent. They won't publicly challenge the official government position, but the argument I'm making is that some business and private actors in the center also become economically worse, right? If that's the case, there is this adverse economic effect even on sanctioning states that we should keep in mind, right? But of course, in the case of the United States, this argument can be negligible, but keep in mind that in other sort of other major sanctioning entities, this could be very, very problematic. Think about the EU sanctions against Russia following Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, right? The European Union decided to join the United States and a few other countries to impose economic sanctions against Russia. What Russia did was retaliate in kind. Russia immediately cut some of these imports of goods and products coming from the European Union, right? European Union is an intergovernmental entity where all these 20 plus countries involved in the union are expected to follow the sanctions regimes, right? What happened was that some of the smaller countries that were part of the union or part of the sanctions regime, like Estonia, incurred significant economic costs because of this broader EU sanctions, right? Even some smaller sectors in Germany and other places in other European countries were not very pleased by the fact that even though impact might not be felt by the economy in general, but there are some of these notable costs that we should address when we have this utility calculus of sanctions. What else? Sort of for standard states, I would also argue that sanctions are become ethically problematic in terms of the net utility of their use, because sanctions could also sort of worsen targeted states' ties with non-sanctioning countries, right? This so-called extraterritorial or secondary sanctions have become pretty popular, especially by the United States, right? Because the United States have very limited sort of economic ties with countries like Iran and North Korea because of the long history of sanctions and these comprehensive restrictions that the United States have already imposed on these countries. What happens is that the US government now tries to also threaten non-sanctioning entities with sanctions to be able to sort of maximize the pressure on target states, right? Obviously, if you're a European oil company or that one who want to do business with the Russian oil sector, you won't be happy with this, right? And you will complain about it, right? Or if you want to buy oil or other things from natural gas from Russia, if the United States sanctions threaten you with sanctions, if you do so, that will also create like more tension between those countries and the United States, right? Sort of like, not only do we have these direct possible effects on the target sender states, their own economic actors, but it also has this possible extraterritorial secondary effects on non-sanctioning states that should also not working in a sender state's favor. So overall, when we let me conclude by making a few key points based on what I said. Sort of from this utilitarianism as a sort of ethical theory. So my overall conclusion is that the net benefit of sanctions tend to be negative, often producing bad sort of adverse effects for both target and sanctioned countries. Even if you're a consequentialist in the sense that you want to look at the outcome of your actions, in the case of sanctions, it's clear to say that utility maximization is not there. The net utility is not in your favor, and it's oftentimes negative, right? It's something to think about when we consider ethical implications, right? We also need to sort of keep in mind that because from an ethical standpoint, right, because sanctions are relatively cheap and easy to implement policy tools, right? They are very susceptible to low threshold for imposition and excessive reliance, right? The sort of so-called alternative policy tool, right? Especially armed intervention is not very popular, right? When our leaders sort of opt for economic sanctions oftentimes as a substitute for sanctions, not always, but sometimes it could be the alternative tool to military intervention. Keep in mind that it could even be more morally problematic if sanctions were only used because they are easy, cheaper, like less politically controversial, and easy to implement. That partially explains why we have this arguably excessive reliance on economic sanctions, right? Especially with the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, we see it is a significant spike in the number of sanctioned cases. But with the turn of the 21st century, what we see that sanctions are becoming more and more popular, particularly financial sanctions, right? Because of the United States' ability to sort of control the existing global financial system. And instead of having this, sending troops on the ground, it's easier to sort of do something with relatively targeted, less controversial and less costly tools. So that's something that from a moral standpoint, it's something to keep in mind that sanctions unfortunately have become more susceptible to the abuse more than ethical use in foreign affairs. So obviously the key takeaway from what we know in the literature is that it's imperative, right, to always have this political gain and civilian pain calculation before levying sanctions. And in that case, we should have this not only a sender's bias interpretation of sanctions. We need to look at the sanctions from both actors involved, senders and targets, and it can't take negative externalities into account, and as well as the likely their low success rate. Overall, for sanctions to work, right, clearly they could be under certain circumstances the least bad option or the lesser evil, but it doesn't negate the fact that they are still likely to cause significant harm on targeted societies. With that, I would like to thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Dursun. So we do have a question in the chat about the root causes of coined theories such as gender, racial, and ethnic biases that continue to fuel inequalities and enable poverty. So I think the question has to do with, how do we address kind of the root causes of these issues that basically make sanctions inherently ineffective, right? That we have all these kind of biases working together that continue to fuel inequality.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and that was the logic behind the targeted sanctions movement, right? In 1990s, especially following the comprehensive sanctions against Iraq. The assumption was that we could improve sanctions, right? We could increase the efficacy of sanctions by targeting specific individuals, right? By asset freezes. In the case of, for instance, China's treatment of the Muslim minority, right? What the US government did was to target specific officials who were complicit, who were part of this genocidal treatment in the country, right? Sort of like what happened was that those type of sanctions, right, are intended to make sure that the Chinese society in general doesn't suffer from them, and then put enough pressure on targeted region, right? So oftentimes what happens is that it does target regions always just find a way to evade them, right? Mm-hmm. When you, first and foremost, asset freezes are oftentimes very symbolic. If you're a repressive leader, you know how to hide your assets, right? You are not going to deposit them in a bank in the United States, right? Or in Europe, right? So those sort of sanctions have the right idea and a way to address this concern over how to minimize the damage on civilians, but the implementation is the biggest challenge, right? We can probably improve the implementation if we have more multilateral involvement by multiple actors in the use of sanctions, right? If it is asset freezes, if we find a way to put the direct pressure on, wrongdoer, whoever committed human rights abuses, right? Or if it is arms embargoes, if all actors or a majority of actors in the international community come together and restrict these repressive regimes' access to arms embargoes, then civilians are highly unlikely to suffer from some of these
damages that we know, right? So this is the big question right now. It has always been one of the most important questions in the policy world to address it. There's not a perfect answer, but I think the best way would be to further fine tune and improve the implementation of these targeted sanctions, and we need to make sure that those targets, right, whether they are drug cartels, repressive leaders, and their sort of military generals or things like that, people like that should sort of we should find a way to make sure they feel the pressure.
So another question. So if sanctions are so ineffective, why are they so pervasive? A state simply wants to show they're doing something to counteract state X's activities. In other words, it sounds like the question is, this is just performative in the end, if it doesn't really work.
I think sort of there is that dimension playing to the home crowd. Maybe that's how we should call it. Yes, sanctioning leaders, right? Whether it's President Trump or whether a prime minister or a leader in Europe, when they impose sanctions, it has that symbolic value of doing something, right? It has that domestic political benefit, right? So yes, that's part of it, right? It has this. It could help them politically, right? And also, I mean, internationally, they might have the right intention. You can't always question that. It might be that they may want to uphold international norms using sanctions, right? And it could be more convenient for them than other tools, right? I can tell you that there's not enough public support for armed intervention, right? That's why the policymakers very first inclination to avoid threat or actual use of force, because they know that that's not domestically popular, right? Mm-hmm. Sanctions has that symbolic value of working in their favor. It's easier to implement. All you have to do is just blacklist 10 major sort of entities in the target states or major leaders in the target countries. Mm-hmm. And it's also cheaper, right? In the sense that oftentimes, especially major powers, don't feel the pressure as much as the targeted entities. That's why I think they remain to be quite popular.
So as I was listening to your talk and trying to think about the ethics of it, you're right, obviously, right, utilitarianism is going to look at the consequences, and you've made a pretty convincing case that the consequences don't recommend sanctions ethically if you're a utilitarian. But I guess I wondered, that raises a question for me, what if sanctions did work, right? So let's say they actually did accomplish the goals of the sanctioning country, but they still had all the collateral damage, right? Would that be enough to make it ethically justifiable? I mean, where do you think the tipping point is?
I would argue that it's not the case still, right? Sort of like, so I think it's really, when you have this consequential approach, right? Sort of like, I would, sort of one thing that I always sort of end my articles on the consequence of sanctions. If I write something about the negative effects of sanctions, some of my research finds that sanctions are bad for human rights, democracy, and targeted states, right? I tell everyone in those cases, I say that even if it is not the intended effect of sanctions, right? Mm-hmm. The intended effect of sanctions is to discourage support for terrorists, right? If there is a significant damage, right, we need to take into account when we label a sanctions regime effective or ineffective, right? Sort of like on a case-by-case basis, right? We need to look at if there's significant sort of damage on civil society, if there is significant restrictions on political rights and freedoms, even if you are able to resolve a trade dispute or cease ongoing sort of civil war, right? That damage should not outweigh, the cost should not outweigh the benefit, right? So in the cases where if the benefit outweighs cost, and if the sanctions were the lesser evil, there could be a ground for arguing that sanctions should be used, right? I think it just depends on the case, right? But part of the problem up until recently is that, right, when we talk about whether sanctions are effective or not, we have long overlooked other sort of unintended effects on target societies, right? And even when you look at all these scholars who work on sanctions, when they call a sanction effective or ineffective, they only look at whether the sender, the sanctioning country, achieve its intended policy, right? If they label something ineffective, they think that sanctions have zero effect. But what I am arguing is that oftentimes it's not a zero effect, it's a negative 5, 10, 15 effect, right? So that negative, even if they account for those counterproductive aspects of sanctions, sanctions might be even less effective than what people have long argued.
So that's interesting. So you would not say that sanctions are morally prohibited altogether, because there might be the occasional case in which it's a lesser evil.
Yeah, I think so. Yes. It's just like the just war tradition, right? War can be like use of force can be morally acceptable given the circumstances, right? Sort of like I think that there are cases that sanctions and are used and should be used, right? If it's an ongoing genocide, right? We have to make sure there is an arms embargo implemented in a way, right, that restricts these perpetrators of violence, their ability to commit all this violence. So I have long argued that sanctions should be used, right? But the key is, of course, is coming up way to fine tune them, improve them further, to minimize civilian damage and improve the efficacy, right? That's where I think we have still a significant sort of gap. We still have a considerable lack of understanding what happens on the ground and what exactly we were told, in theory that sanctions do, right? Sort of like when you look at the reality on ground, things are even worse than what we have long assumed, right? Sanctions can be improved, and of course should be used if it is a lesser evil and more appealing tool.
So another question from the chat: would developing countries benefit more if there were no sanctions? Do sanctions on these countries make them look bad around the world?
Of course, sort of studies find that EU and US sanctions actually cause a considerable sort of economic damage on target states, right? Even if they are sort of symbolic sanctions, on average, they lose quite a bit because of their heavy dependence on sort of United States, right? The international community for their external trade ties. So there is that direct economic damage. It worsens, like it reduces, it undermines, contracts their economy, right? There is also that the panic effect, right? When you impose sanctions against Iran, nobody wants to trade with Iran. Whether when the United States imposes these sanctions, all of a sudden Iran's ability to trade with even other third-party states become much more restricted, right? And there is that, obviously, it damages their currency. It causes all sorts of problems in terms of using their banking industry to have all these financial transactions that we have to be able to sort of maintain their regular sort of economic exchanges. So it does have it could have a very serious sort of effect on targeted economies. And if you're a developed country, of course, there's already this economic gap, right? If you look at the power the power balance, right? You're already you are already at a disadvantaged position compared to a major power like China and the United States. When you face sanctions from them, of course, you get the worst of it, right? Those targets, the sanctioning states oftentimes don't feel the pressure as much as you do. So it does. What happens is that it probably maintains and even worsens the income gap that you have with these developed countries.
So that brings in maybe another moral consideration, which is fairness. I mean, is it kind of an abuse of power in a way, right? Given the asymmetry between a country like the United States and a country like Iran, to impose these kind of sanctions, aside from the consequences.
Yes, it could be abused, right? It could be exploited, right? And we see that. So if you look at the history of sanctions, if you go back all the way to the ancient times, sanctions have always been used, right? The powerful always uses it is to its own favor. There's always that dimension that, yes, even in the cases where we are told that we have this moral sort of duty to act, right? Whether it's Iran, Venezuela, others. I'm not questioning it might be the case, but we should always look at it from an ethical sort of standpoint and really pay attention what exactly, to what extent action, sort of like the words meet the deed, right? Do they really mean this, right? In other words, from the based on the just war theory, the tradition, like right intention is always something that we need to have this question to keep our sanctioning states accountable, right? But the abuse of sanctions is not new. Very similar to the way that countries, states have long, exploited, took advantage of their sort of military spirit. The same sort of logic easily applies to economic power as well.
Do you think there's a sovereignty issue as well?
That's sort of scholars think about work on that. Yeah, I mean, sort of depends on what you look at, what sort of like who the actor is, right? Sort of like the interesting is that, right, external interventions could be arguably more justifiable if it is under the sort of leadership of the United Nations, or if there is a sort of like a multilateral consensus on doing something, right? In such cases, maybe they are more justifiable if sanctions are through the UN Security Council, right? But unilateral sanctions always, right? Whether even if they have the right intention, could open that door, right? There is that sort of like violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty of targeted states by sort of unilaterally denying them access to all these necessary resources for their economy to function regularly.
So this is a peace talk. Are economic sanctions just war by another name? Are they kind of violence?
Yeah, I mean, some prefer to call them as like it has the same siege mentality, right? During a warfare, right? Sort of like it's an economic warfare, right? Sort of it's a type of war without violent means, right? But sanctions could, even though it's not sort of, we don't see an actual use of force, but what we see is that the use of sanctions could result in similar effects that you would observe during a war, right? It's really, even in the case of sanctions, I mean, hard to make this combatant versus non-combatant distinction, right? That's probably easier to observe, but in the sanctions, if it fails to fulfill sort of just war theory's discrimination principle, even could be worse than war, because you have these sort of bystanders and the significant sort of damage or effects that they incur, right? So clearly, we have the double effect that you expect in every sort of policy action, right? If you bomb a factory which is producing nuclear weapons, of course, civilians around that bomb that factory will incur the sanctions, but it will from the effects of that bombing. But in the case of sanctions, that distinction is even harder. The double effect will mean that you actually are good at targeting the actual sort of wrongdoer, right? Whether it's a repressive regime or a drug cartel or whatever, because you don't really fail to put the pressure on it. These innocent bystanders even get the worst of it, right? There's no double effect. There's this uneven worse effect that those who are not involved in this, dispute incur because of sanctions.
Are there any better options than sanctions if you don't want to engage in armed conflict?
Yeah, that's the question. It depends. It's a case by case issue. I think I know it's an easy answer to make that. I don't think there is a better option, but there could be cases there, right? If you're talking about a genocide, I know these are rare events, outliers, but in those cases, like expecting that all of a sudden sanctions will stop an ethnic cleansing is not realistic, right? I mean, again, this is not probably a good example, but in the case of China and China's treatment of the Uyghur minority groups, what does exactly sanction? How realistic that sanctions will actually put enough pressure on those officials to stop doing this ethnic cleansing that they have been doing, right? So that it has that, some will argue that, yeah, but that's not the intention of sanctions, right? We know they want to work, but it has still this symbolic value that shows that actually we care about these things, right? But then it just means that the actual end will never be accomplished, right? You are using these means to have this symbolic sort of stance against all those human rights abuses, but in those cases it's unrealistic, not realistic to assume that things will all of a sudden improve, right? Obviously, that doesn't mean that if you were to use alternative sort of tools, things will get better, right? Sort of maybe a diplomacy or sort of threats of sanctions and threats of military force could be better in terms of this utility calculus than actually using them as because they can be quite counterproductive.
Because doing nothing in those kinds of extreme cases that you're citing seems to be morally worse.
Sure.
unless though, I mean, you end up using sanctions that actually end up harming more people on top of the people who are already being harmed.
Sure.
But it sounds like we have relatively few options that would actually make a difference unless we were willing to use military conflict. Right.
Sure.
So it's a conundrum. Another question, are there certain countries for which sanctions are more effective?
Yeah, there is that's sort of like an important area of research that sort of we know that actually democracies are a lot more susceptible to sanctions than autocracies. In the case of democracies, it's harder for leaders to sort of move things around to satisfy their support base because they're a large portion of the society. They are also more worried about their own political survival. They can use repression to stay in power. Hence, if sanctions hurt the economy, they know that they may lose in the next elections. That's why they're looking a way to resolve this dispute with the sender countries. Allies tend to be more receptive of sanctions than rivals, right? The United States is better at pressuring its own allies than rivals, which makes sense, I guess. In the case of rivals, you have this future conflict expectations, right? If you give in, you know that the United States may further exploit this and make you look weak and try to extract other concessions. That's why rivals are very skeptical of sanctions, and even if it's the right intention, they are more likely to sort of not acquiesce. Multilateral sanctions, right? We know that sanctions work better if multiple countries involved, right? It puts more economic pressure on targeted states and also increase the legitimacy of those sanctions, right? It has the right signaling effect in the sense that they seem to be more legitimate. So yeah, I mean, multilateral sanctions, sanctions against allies, democracies, sanctions that are good at putting pressure on target regimes and their close circles, right? If those people who are key supporters of the regime incur the cost, they will also put some pressure on the target regime to find a way to end this dispute with sanctioning countries.
So if I were to ask you for a success story, like, can you think of a case where you're like, this is a morally exemplary case of sanctions? Do you have one?
Not really. I guess maybe I'm too skeptical because I've been thinking about the all these adverse effects for so long. I guess I've just sort of like stopped looking at the success cases. But I mean, in the past, I guess, I mean, the South Africa case is overused, but the South Africa case is one of those, you know, where against apartheid regime, we know that there was this huge international support, and the Black community in South Africa supported the sanctions, and the white minority controlled research had to sort of do something about it. So boycotts and sanctions had some effects, some positive effects, right? But those cases are really, really rare. Right, and I can't think of anything else right now that will I would say that this is a success story without any sort of externalities.
How about a paradigmatic case of moral failure?
The Iraq case is the sort of the most well-known, I think. So the comprehensive sanctions against Iraq was by far, is that what you're asking, one of the sort of like the cases? And the Haiti case in 1990s is one of them. So these poor countries, really, when they face sanctions, so what happens is that things even get worse. The Haitian economy was significantly downgraded following the 1991 sort of military coup, right? The military coup, the military leadership was in charge of all this problem in the economy, but sanctions even make the things worse because it's such a poor country. Once you cut aid and once you cut their access to gasoline and other basic needs, it could make it a huge failure. So things like that. I mean, Cuba is an interesting example too, right? So it's like, again, we don't always put the blame on sanctioning states. Target leaders have also committed all these problems, and they could be sometimes even the real reason why those people suffer. But sanctions oftentimes just make the things worse. That's why it's sort of morally problematic to sort of intensify or amplify this ongoing suffering that people are already incurring.
Mhm. So what's next in your research as you pursue this? What's the next big question we need to get a handle on?
Yeah, I personally am more these days reading on secondary sanctions, right? Even after you asked me to do this presentation, I had to revisit the article that I wrote. Again, I'm not an ethics scholar, but when I read it, I thought like we are really paying attention to this ethical dimension of sanctions from the sender and target's perspective, right? Whether you use the utilitarianism or just war theory. How about those third-party states, right? Sort of, I think it might be even more ethically problematic if you bring in those secondary sanctions and cause that these the bystanders, right? European countries in the case of Iran's US sanctions, right? I want to sort of like think a little bit more about what those secondary sanctions exactly do, whether they are effective, and perhaps in the future write something on the moral implications of those extraterritorial sanctions.
Great. All right. I don't think I see any more questions in the chat. So I did upload the article that this talk is based on. You should find the PDF in the chat if you want to download that before you leave the meeting. And I've put some links in the chat too about the Ethics Center if you want to check out what we do every year. Of course, thank you so much, Dursun, for the really interesting talk. Lots to think about for today. So I think I'm going to end it there. And everybody, thank you so much for coming. I hope, especially Western people coming back from spring break, say thanks for making time for this on your first day back. And hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Great talk. Thank you, Dursun.
Thank you.
And I think Dursun said he could stick around for a few minutes if people have individual questions. I did put his email in the chat as well, if you'd like to follow up with him individually. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.